It was one of those peaceful Sunday mornings where everything feels like it's finally falling into place. My wife, Emily, and I had just moved into our new home a few months ago, a quiet suburban neighborhood lined with trimmed hedges, neat driveways, and more than a few nosy neighbors. Emily was about 7 months pregnant at the time, glowing with that fierce maternal strength and determination. We'd chosen this neighborhood for the schools, the safety, the promise of community. We had no idea we were walking into a territory policed by someone who fancied herself the queen of the cul-de-sac, the HOA president, whom everyone not so affectionately called Karen. Karen wasn't her real name, but the nickname had stuck for good reason. Mid-50s, tight bob haircut, oversized sunglasses, always clutching her Starbucks cup like a scepter. She didn't just enforce HOA rules, she weaponized them. Trash cans left out for 10 extra minutes. Warning notice. A flower pot 2 inches beyond regulation placement. Citation. She'd patrol the streets in her spotless silver Lexus SUV like it was a tank, stopping only to glare disapprovingly at the slightest deviation from the rulebook she seemed to have memorized. We kept our heads down, mostly. I'd done my time, 15 years in the Navy SEALs. I wasn't interested in drama, especially not while preparing to welcome our first child. But sometimes, no matter how much discipline you carry, trouble finds you. It started with a letter, typed, cold, and passive-aggressively signed, with neighborhood pride, Karen. She accused us of violating HOA guidelines by parking on the street. The problem? We weren't. Our car was in the driveway, always had been. Emily, tired and hormonal, had wanted to go confront her, but I held her back. Not worth it, I told her. Let it go. But Karen didn't let it go. She escalated. She started showing up during the day, pacing our front yard with a clipboard, snapping photos of our bushes, our porch lights, even our mailbox. Emily tried to speak to her once, cordially, just asking why we were being singled out, but Karen just turned, lifted her glasses, and said, "You people really need to read the handbook." The term, "you people," rang louder in my ears than anything else. I kept my cool, for now. Then came the day that crossed every line. Emily had gone out to get the mail. I was inside, halfway through sanding down a wooden crib I'd decided to make for the baby. I heard the sound of a car engine revving, then a sharp metallic scrape. A scream followed. My stomach turned cold. I dropped the sander and ran out barefoot. There, at the edge of our driveway, Emily was pinned against the mailbox post by the silver Lexus. She was crying out in pain, one hand gripping her belly, the other braced against the hood. The driver door swung open, and out stepped Karen, more annoyed than alarmed. "Why would you walk in front of my car like that?" she barked, ignoring the obvious. My training kicked in before my rage could. I rushed to Emily. "Are you okay? Where does it hurt?" She was trembling, but conscious. No blood, thank God. But her leg was pinned, and she kept repeating, "The baby, the baby." I turned to Karen. "Back the car up, now." She blinked at me like I'd insulted her. "Excuse me, this is technically HOA property. Your wife stepped into the street. Back the damn car up before I pull you out of it." I must have had that look, that silent, steel-eyed expression that tells someone they're about half a second from understanding what real consequences feel like. Because she hesitated, muttered something under her breath, and got back in. The Lexus reversed with a grumble, freeing Emily, who collapsed into my arms. I scooped her up and carried her inside. She was sobbing, in shock, but slowly regaining control. I called 911, got the paramedics there within minutes. They checked Emily over, took her to the hospital. I followed behind, fists clenched the whole way. The baby was fine, thank God. A few bruises, but nothing serious. Emily's leg was sore but not broken. The doctors kept her for observation overnight. While she slept, I sat in that stiff hospital chair and seethed. Not just at the accident, but at the callousness, the entitlement. Karen hadn't even tried to call. No apology, no concern. I'd seen her talking to a cop when the paramedics left, waving her hands, painting herself as the victim. That's when something in me snapped. Not in a chaotic, reckless way, but in a calculated, deliberate way. I went home the next morning, after ensuring Emily was safe and resting. I showered, shaved, put on my uniform. Well, not the full regalia, but enough to make a point. Medals, badges, insignia. Then I printed out the photos from the paramedics, the police report, and copies of Karen's earlier written complaints. I knew how to build a case. I'd done it in hostile territories with lives on the line. Then I walked across the street. She was in her yard, pruning roses with those little shears like she was the Queen of Versailles. She glanced up and immediately scowled. I thought you'd be at the hospital. I didn't respond right away. Just held up the folder. This is a formal notice, I said calmly. I'm pressing charges. Vehicular assault. Endangerment of a pregnant woman. And I'm taking it to the HOA board, the city council, and every local news outlet that'll listen. She scoffed, trying to play it off. It was an accident. No, I said, stepping closer. An accident is when someone owns their mistake. You didn't even get out of the car until I told you to. You didn't apologize. You didn't call to check on her. And you've been harassing us since day one. I've been patient. I've been quiet. I've been kind. But you hurt my family. There was a pause. I could see the gears turning in her head. She realized she wasn't dealing with just another neighbor anymore. She was dealing with someone trained to operate in the darkest places on earth and still maintain integrity. And right now, I was done playing neighborly. I'll be filing the complaint this afternoon. You'll be hearing from my attorney by end of week. You have every right to act like a tyrant in your little HOA meetings, but you crossed the line when you used your car like a weapon. That ends now. I turned and walked away, her mouth frozen open mid-retort. For the first time since we moved in, Karen didn't say a word. Later that week, the HOA board received over a dozen letters from other residents, people who had also suffered under Karen's overreach but had been too afraid to speak up. Turns out, all they needed was for someone to take a stand. And stand I did. For my wife. For our child. For peace. It had been 3 days since I confronted Karen. In that time, the neighborhood had changed in a way I hadn't anticipated. Word travels fast in communities like ours, and my encounter with her had set off a ripple effect that none of us could have foreseen. Neighbors who had never so much as waved at me before were suddenly stopping by. Some brought baked goods, others just came with stories. Stories about Karen's reign of petty tyranny, how she'd fined people for wind chimes being too loud, for Halloween decorations that weren't removed promptly, or for having backyard barbecues that lasted past 8 p.m. It was like someone had flipped a switch. People had been afraid to speak up, to challenge her. But now that someone had stood firm, someone she hadn't been able to steamroll, they found their voices. One man, Joe from the corner house, told me that Karen had threatened to report his teenage daughter for loitering because she was reading on the front porch after dark. Another neighbor, Angela, recounted how Karen had once taken it upon herself to trim someone's hedges without permission and then build them for the landscaping service. I documented every one of these accounts. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted to make sure she couldn't hide behind her fake smile and printed bylaws anymore. I wasn't the kind of man who believed in vengeance. Justice, though, that was something I understood deeply. Emily was recovering well. She was resting more, and I made sure she had everything she needed. The baby was fine, kicking like a little warrior. Every night, I'd sit beside her and feel those tiny movements and remind myself why I was doing all this. It wasn't just about what Karen had done. It was about making sure no one ever thought it was okay to endanger a mother and child and brush it off like a parking mishap. A week after the incident, the HOA held a special meeting. The board had received not only my complaint but several others. Karen was still president, but that grip she had. It was slipping fast. I decided to attend the meeting, not as a vigilante, but as a homeowner with a voice. It was held at the community center, an overly sterile building with bright fluorescent lighting and chairs arranged in a loose circle. The room was packed. People stood along the walls, murmuring, glancing in my direction as I walked in. I wore civilian clothes, but I moved with purpose. I didn't need a uniform to command attention. Karen sat at the head of the room, flanked by two board members who looked like they regretted being there. She smiled when she saw me, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Reynolds," she said, her voice sugary. "We're glad you could join us. I understand you've filed some concerns." I didn't respond to the bait. I stood calmly, nodded, and began. "I'm here to address what happened to my wife last week, but also to speak for those in this room who've stayed silent out of fear, embarrassment, or fatigue." I laid out the facts. I presented the police report, the photographs, and a recording from our Ring camera that captured her SUV rolling forward into Emily as she reached for the mail. You could hear the impact, the screech of the tires, and my wife's cry. Karen squirmed but kept that composed expression, as if she could smile her way through this. Then I handed over a binder, full of written statements from neighbors. "These are accounts from over a dozen residents," I continued. "People who've been harassed, fined unfairly, and subjected to intimidation tactics that go beyond what any reasonable person would expect from a homeowners association. Karen has turned this neighborhood into her own personal kingdom." The room shifted. People murmured, nodded. Some clapped softly. Karen tried to speak, but this time, the board president, a soft-spoken woman named Laura, intervened. "Karen, we've reviewed these materials," Laura said. "And while we must respect due process, the evidence is significant. The board is voting tonight on whether to suspend your authority pending an independent investigation." Karen's jaw tightened. "You can't do that. I am this HOA." "No, Karen," someone muttered from the crowd. "You're not. You never were." And just like that, the vote was called. Hands raised, one by one, until the majority was clear. Karen's face paled. For the first time since we moved into the neighborhood, she looked unsure, unbalanced. She stood up abruptly and stormed out of the room. The applause that followed wasn't raucous, but it was real. Genuine relief. After the meeting, people came up to thank me. I wasn't used to that. I'd spent most of my life working in the shadows, doing jobs that went unrecognized by design. Praise made me uncomfortable, but I accepted their gratitude with humility. Not because I needed it, but because they needed to give it. That night, I returned home to Emily, who was waiting on the porch with a blanket draped over her lap. "How'd it go?" she asked. I kissed her forehead and sat beside her. "She's done. They voted her out." She smiled softly. "Good." We sat there in silence for a while, listening to the wind move through the trees. Peaceful. The way it should have been from the start. Over the next few weeks, the neighborhood began to breathe again. Small things changed. Decorations appeared that hadn't been there before. People began talking more openly, waving more often. The new interim HOA board focused on transparency, sending out surveys and asking for input rather than issuing mandates. As for Karen, we didn't see much of her. Her Lexus sat untouched in her driveway for days at a time. Rumor had it she was looking to sell, maybe move to a gated community where she could start fresh. I didn't care. She was no longer a threat. I didn't go after her in court, though I could have. Emily and I discussed it, but in the end, we decided that removing her power and reclaiming our peace was enough. Let her sit with the weight of her actions. That's a sentence in itself. Life went on. The crib I'd been working on was finished and placed in the nursery, painted soft gray with ocean blue accents. Emily loved it. She said it made her feel safe knowing our child would sleep in something built with care, built by my hands. And me, I realized something along the way. Being a SEAL taught me how to survive chaos. But it was fatherhood, marriage, and this quiet war in suburbia that taught me how to fight for peace. Not with weapons, but with presence, resolve, and truth. I didn't choose the battle with Karen. But I ended it. Not just for my wife. For every family that wants to come home and breathe easy.